You know, this time was coming. I foretold this 10 days ago. This is the day, 1431, May the 30th, that Jeanne d'Arc is burned at the stake. Victim of the so-called most important trial in history, second only to the trial of Christ. Jeanne d'Arc was captured by a French nobleman working under the English and put on trial. The preliminary inquiries about her were described by the men who commissioned to collect the testimonies against her, try to find some dirt on her in her own town, as I have found nothing concerning Jeanne that I would not have liked to find out about my own sister. The British couldn't find anything to charge her with until eventually they ended up with heresy. Heresy was a capital crime, only for a repeat offense. And they were able to concoct a way to charge her of cross-dressing. After she got imprisoned, she wasn't put in an ecclesiastical prison, in a church prison, where you are attended and guarded, so to speak, by other women, but instead she was put in a British-controlled town, in a castle, guarded by men, by soldiers. And she was dressing as a man to make it harder and to prevent her from being sexually assaulted. She was found guilty the first time of cross-dressing. She then recanted because she was told she could have went to attend mass if she dressed like a woman, but then she went back to the prison, redressed as a man, and that's the second charge of cross-dressing, that's heresy, and that's burning at the stake. It was an incredible sequences of events, which I recommend everyone to read about because it's actually a pretty cool read on the trial of Jeanne d'Arc. Now, on a more lightweight note, which doesn't include burning at the stake, today we are talking about specs in this game that are easy to play and specs in this game that are hard to play. The continued campaign on finding what to play for 9.1, getting interested in some specs to play, I found out that it could have been interesting to talk about the specs in this way. We have talked about the specs based on how fast they are to play. We have talked in the specs based on how fun. We have talked in the specs looking at the current balance, the balance tuning, the buffs and nerfs planned for 9.1, thinking about which could be looking good, which could be looking bad. Now we are looking at another angle that you might be interested in when thinking about a spec. What if it's very hard? What if it's very easy? Maybe you are ticking all the boxes. Great. I like how fast this spec plays. I like that it's considered fun. I like that it's considered meta for next tier. However, I don't like that it is brain dead easy. I don't like that it is 2 buttons, or maybe it's the opposite. However, it's a little bit too complicated. I am a little bit too stressed trying to play this spec properly. So this is something that can change the perspective of people towards certain specs to play. So let's start with the first on the list, which is going to be the healers. Healers are of course quite unique when it comes to how they play. They are not a DPS, they don't have a rotation, so they have other things they need to be interested in. They don't have a start point and an end point and then they go back and restart the whole thing. There is actually one healer that does this, we will see, but all the other healers are more diverse, they are more flexible. It is said in the history books that there is never going to be a single pull where your healer is going to be clicking the same buttons the same way, as opposed to a DPS following a rotation. That's because, of course, it always changes. The people who take damage always changes, the amount of people, type of damage they take, it is always going to be different. Every single pull. It's never going to repeat the exact same way. So already by default, healers will always be a little bit more different and varied than DPS and tanks. Let's start with the simplest of healers, okay? The simplest of healers is Restoration Druid. If you wanted to play a healer, if you were interested in playing a healer that plays reasonably fast, then the Restoration Druid ticks the box of being a pretty fast healer. It doesn't exactly tick the box of being meta, because it's okay, it's good, but not in the top 3, and it doesn't tick the box particularly well about being fun, especially when it comes to raiding, but it certainly ticks the box of being simple to play, being easy to get a lot out of it. Why? Because Druid healing looks like this. Druid healing, when it comes to the amount of casts you are going to be clicking, basically the amount of buttons you will be clicking in the entire fight, in the entire Mythic Plus pool and whatnot, is going to be something like 70 to 80% rejuvenations. The vast majority of your time will be spent blanketing the entire group, the raid, with rejuvenations. You're going to be using more or less wild growth on cooldown, and then you're going to be using regrowth in between to top some players off when you don't have much else to do. And this is basically your playstyle. This is how a druid heals in a raid. As you can see, there are some pretty big spikes. Those are generated by Flourish. They're surprising cooldowns coming from a talent, which is very, very powerful. Better even than Tranquility, which is the orange bump you see there. And Flourish doesn't even change how they play. They just continue casting their hots over time, and they just have 2 of them, so it's very simple. It's very straightforward. It is very difficult to play Restoration Druid wrong. If you were new about Restoration Druid and I told you just click Rejuvenation, every time you don't have anything to do, click Rejuvenation on a player that doesn't have Rejuvenation. Every time Wild Growth is off cooldown, so every 10 or so seconds, click Wild Growth. It's gonna target automatically people. You don't even have to aim it. You don't even have to think smartly about Wild Growth. Just click it. And then look at these notes. It says that at 1:30, 3 and 4:30 you're going to be clicking Nourish. Even if you do that without any clue about anything else about your kit, you're going to be doing decently. The skill floor is very high for Restoration Druid, and the skill ceiling, the skill expression level of a Restoration Druid in Mythic raiding, in general, is very, very low. You do certainly have more window of skill expression, more window of showing up. You can do more things than just spamming Rejuvenation in Mythic Plus. In Mythic Plus, of course, you don't need to spam Rejuvenation because you only have to cover 5 people. It's pretty simple. In Mythic Plus, you have Life Bloom gaining more, way more value. You have Swiftmend becoming way more important. You have Regrowth also becoming more important, as well as your large arsenal of utility, from the interrupts to the knockbacks or the vortex, things like the Enrage Dispel. You add an extra ability for you to use, like Cenarion Ward. You have the ability to go into Heart of the Wild with Balance Affinity and start doing some damage. So it becomes a little bit more varied, it becomes a little bit more diverse, but the base of the spec, it's just Rejuvenation. That is still the core of the build. It is pretty simplistic, it's not that difficult to get into. So if you were looking into a simple spec to start with as a healer, that is also pretty fast, we have to remember this, because of the amount of instant abilities you are casting, so you get to be pretty fast. Many abilities cast over 1 minute compared to other healers, then Restoration Druid is a good pick. Now, going up by a little, we get Mistweaver Monk and Holy Paladin. Now, Mistweaver Monk, while being more unique than Restoration Druid for sure, and of course not really having anything to do with HOTS too much, it is still on the easy side. It doesn't have much of any, rotations or things to follow when they have to heal. Yes, it is simple, but it is still boring. Refreshing every 9 seconds or so of refreshing Jadewind. They get to use Rising Sun Kick off cooldown. They get to use Renewing Mists, making sure they don't cap in their charges every single time. And then they get to use Essence Font for AoE whenever it's up. That is going to make up for the vast majority of their active healing. That's almost 40% of their total healing coming from just 3 abilities that they basically just click on cooldown every time. So there is no really big thinking going around Mistweaver Monk. It is pretty approachable when it comes to healer specs. It does become a little bit more complex in Mythic Plus. This is going to be a recurring thing for most specs. You just have more options inside a Mythic Plus key. So you have more chances and more possibilities of failing because you have to decide on more things than just healing when you come into Mythic Plus, whereas raids are more straightforward to that end. So Monk does check the box of being fun. It does check the box of being not very fast to play. Unfortunately, for now at least, it doesn't really check the box of being meta, and it remains pretty simplistic to play. You don't have too many things to look for when a big damage window is coming. That's the main thing when you're playing healer. When you're playing healer in raids, is a big hit coming? I have to start preparing. I have to start setting up. This is what increases the difficulty of a healer in a raid encounter. You have to keep track of the damage windows of a different encounter. You have to know how far apart they are, and you have to plan your abilities. In the case of Restoration Druid, you have nothing. Your plan doesn't change. You're still just spamming one hot. In the case of Mistweaver Monk, it is a little bit more. You are trying to spread some Renewing Mist. You're using your Fist Weaving to do some extra healing. And then you're using your Essence Font whenever the damage ability comes out. But beyond that, there isn't much more complexity. When a lot of your healing also comes from abilities you're only clicking a couple of times the entire encounter, like the enveloping breath, which comes from your Chi-Ji, and your revival, which is a single click. It doesn't make it too complicated of a spec. It is one of the specs I would warmly recommend if it was meta. It is average to get into in terms of difficulty. It is fun to play. It has a great theme and setting and an art theme and all of that. It's just not very meta right now. So when it comes to accessibility, the other one in this tier is what I would suggest, which is Holy Paladin. I mean, Holy Paladin kind of speaks for itself. This is your general run-of-the-mill Holy Paladin. What you do when you play Holy Paladin is you click your Crusader Strike on cooldown, your Judgment on cooldown, your Hammer of Wrath on cooldown, and your Holy Shock on cooldown. Whenever you get to 3 Holy Power, you dump it with Light of Dawn, most of the time. That's over. That's your entire thing you will be doing in the entire encounter. There is going to be no variation, no difference in how you play. If you're playing with Divine Toll, you are saving Divine Toll for the windows of damage, so you can spread 5 Holy Shocks immediately. If you're playing with Ashen Hallow, you are saving Ashen Hallow for the big windows. The difference is that if you're playing with Divine Toll, you will see these tiny little bumps every minute or so that are thanks to Divine Toll without a bigger spike, so to speak. Whereas if you're playing with Ashen Hallow, this comically large bump of healing thanks to Ashen Hallow. But for the rest, it is a very, very, very simple spec. I am putting it still higher than Restoration Druid because healers might not be used at actually doing melee DPS positioning. That's why it is not as simple as Restoration. You do actually have, throughout all of this, keep in range of enemy targets, actually damage them. So you have to stay in melee range. It gets a little bit harder sometimes, so it does require a little bit more knowledge about the fight. Once you do know the fight though, it becomes extremely easy. It is almost impossible to fail playing a Holy Paladin. Just click literally whatever target you see around you not being at full HP, click Holy Shock on them, click Light of Dawn in your melee group. Light of Dawn is going to hit 5 players, Light of Dawn them in their face, and you will always heal someone. Big chunk of your healing is going to come passively because Beacon of Light is going to automatically heal the tank. Glimmer of Light and Shock Barrier are also going to automatically happen thanks to Holy Shock, so you don't really have to do too much when healing as a Holy Paladin. In Mythic Plus it becomes a little bit more complicated. In Mythic Plus you have to get even more knowledge because using properly Ashen Hallow in Mythic Plus is tricky. You have to get into competent pre-made groups to be able to get full effectiveness of Ashen Hallow. You have to start also trading in with things like Light of the Martyr as an actual heal. You will have more effect on things like Blessing of Protection, even Lay on Hands. Your stun, your shining light are going to become more important in Mythic Plus. As I mentioned, this is going to be a recurring theme for most of the healers. But in general, the spec on its own is very straightforward. Back to the original point I mentioned, the difficulty of a healer being how much do you have to prepare for each big damage window of a raid encounter or even a Mythic Plus pack, which of the big packs are going to be dangerous. For Holy Paladin, there is little to no change. Even when you use Wings, or if you're using Avenging Crusader, for example, your rotation stays the same, what you're doing stays the same. You're still using Crusader Strike, you're still using Judgment, and you're still using Hammer of Wrath. You're still dumping it with Light of Dawn. In Mythic Plus, you will be using a little bit more of your single target heal, Word of Glory, and even your damaging finisher, Shield of the Righteous, but for the most part, it is still pretty straightforward. Now, a tier above these, right in the middle, we have Holy Priest. So, Holy Priest is a slower spec. It's not particularly meta. It is pretty enjoyable to play. And now this is also a decently complex spec. You are going to be playing around your Holy Word, so your Serenity and your Sanctify. Most of the time you will be going for Serenity for your single target heal. Between Flesh Concentration massively spiking up your heal usage, you're just gonna get much more CDR out of your single target heal as opposed to Sanctify, which gets reduced by Renew, and you're not really casting Renew, you're getting it for free from Benediction and from Salvation, and Prayer of Healing is also something you're not casting very often, so you're not getting much CDR out of Sanctify, your AoE heal. You have to juggle, essentially, with cooldown reduction. Your Holy Ward single target heal gets reduced when you cast Heal and Flash Heal, and your AoE gets reduced when you're casting Prayer of Healing. You have your heal, which is going to be the cornerstone of your build, And just because heal is what you will be spamming most of the time, it just makes it a little bit more complex than Restoration Druid that I put at the bottom, and even Holy Paladin that I put a tier above. Why? Well, because heal is a hard-casted ability. Yes, sure, priests are going to be playing with Flesh Concentration, which is going to reduce the cast time of heal by up to 1 second. So it's not going to be a 2.5 cast, which is very long. It's going to be much shorter. However, it is still a hard casted ability. You don't have the freedom of a Restoration Druid spamming Rejuvenation, or even a Holy Paladin casting Holy Shock instantly. With heal, you are more immobile. With heal, you are more liable to overhealing and basically wasting your heal, because you have to hardcast, and essentially in that time frame the target you're trying to heal can get topped by someone else, while also making your positioning more important because you're standing still, not moving, while you have to cast heal. So it just makes it more complex simply because of that. Talking about the big healing windows doing a raid encounter, you have to prepare your Holy Word Sanctify before the big damage comes in. Make sure Circle of Healing is off cooldown, Prayer of Mending, and then maybe even Holy Word Salvation and Divine Hymn. So you have more things to keep track of, to use during these big windows. So in my opinion, of the 3 throughput specs, of the 3 specs that lack damage reduction, so Restoration Druid, Mistweaver, and Holy Priest is the more complex of the 3, the one that offers you more options and windows to express yourself when it comes to raids. When it comes to Mythic Plus, it's the opposite. When it comes to Mythic Plus, Holy Priest is not quite as complex as Restoration Druid and Mistweaver Monk. They just have more things that they can do in Mythic Plus because of their utility. Their options, the things they can choose to do in a key are superior. In terms of complexity, in terms of engagement, in things you can choose to do, just offer you a higher skill ceiling when it comes to playing in Mythic Plus, as opposed to Raid. Now, into the top 2. The top 2 for raiding in terms of complexity and choices and options and things you can do. We have Restoration Shaman. Now, why is Restoration Shaman here in the first place? Well, number one, they are a lower, smaller, tinier version of what a Discipline Priest wants to do. You want to have a window in which you prep your healing for a big window of damage so you can respond appropriately. They have to set up their Healing Rain, their Cloudburst, their Riptide on multiple targets, prep their Primordial Wave, and then multi-heal with Healing Wave thanks to Primordial Wave, use your Wellspring properly, and then explode your Cloudburst. This happens essentially at twice the rate, a little bit over twice the rate of what a Discipline Priest window is going to look like. No other healers below Resto Shaman in this list has this type of healing profile. As you can see in the profile itself, it's filled with tiny little bumps. All these little bumps with the tips being the light blue you can see there is just a bunch of cloudbursts. So that is just the culmination of all the other healing you have done in that window, upped, increased by the cloudburst. Restoration Druid is just going to continue to spam Rejuvenation and use Wild Growth regardless of what's happening. Holy Paladin will continue its damage rotation and its Holy Shock spam regardless of what's happening. Same goes for Mistweaver Monk and the spreading of Renewing Mist and using Essence Font and their damage ability while they're trying and failing to Feastweave. Shaman is the first one that has a very clear plan on what to do when it comes to incoming damaging abilities. When nothing is happening, you are spreading Riptide, you are hard casting Healing Wave, waiting, looking at low targets here and there, using them on your tanks, and then you have Crystallize on Stone Legion Generals, you have Cleansing Pain or Blood Price coming in the Natrius, maybe you have the Stomp coming in for Sludge Fist, maybe the Dancing Fever in Council of Blood. So you have 10 or so seconds before any of that is happening. That is a process that needs to be repeated for all of the different damage spikes in the encounter. So you do have to know about all of the damage spikes in the encounter, and then you do have to prep properly for all of the damage spikes in the encounter. This is just harder than simply continuing your rotation as if nothing else happened, which is exactly what the specs below Resto Shaman are going to be doing for the most part. Outside of their major cooldown, because if you paid attention, I haven't even mentioned Healing Tide Totem, I haven't even mentioned Spirit Link Totem. Just like Tranquility, just like Divine Hymn, just like Aura Mastery. The normal rotation that continues throughout an encounter is just more complex and requires more knowledge from a Restoration Shaman than from a Restoration Druid or a Holy Paladin. Now, talking about the knowledge required when it comes to your rotation, we have last in this list Discipline Priest. I mentioned to you the many little bumps of the healing done by Restoration Shamans because of their Cloudburst. These are the bumps by the Discipline Priest. Of course, that is Spirit Shell. In 9.1, these bumps are going to be a little bit further apart because the cooldown is going to be increased to 1.5 minutes. But yeah, that is what is happening. Discipline Priest functions in a similar way of a Resto Shaman, just way more focused in bigger windows. Further apart, but bigger windows. The reason why they're here is because their whole thing, their whole preparation is even more strict than a Restoration Shaman. The things I mentioned in a Resto Shaman can be done in whatever order. As long as you remembered to activate Cloudburst Totem, you can do the following more or less in whichever way you want, whichever order you want. Discipline is much more strict. Spirit Shell is only 10 seconds long. The Atonement on your characters is expiring pretty quickly. You don't have much of a window for that to all fit within those time frames. So you have to do this order, this window pretty precisely. You have to start spamming Power Word Shield, depending on how fast you are, how many, 7 of them. Then double Power Word Radiance to spread even more Atonements out. Then you're activating Spirit Shell, you're using your Ray Shell, you're using your Trinket, whatever sort of buff you can activate immediately, and then you go for your damage rotation. Your Schism, your Mind Games, your Mind Blast, your Penance, all shrunk in a very tiny window to try to make your Spirit Shell absorb as big as possible, right before the ability comes, so a few seconds before. And this is the vast majority of the healing of a Discipline Priest, which is why it's so important, is why it's so crucial. If you fuck up this one, if you fuck up that rotation, that window, you are going to be doing much less healing. Compare the fucking up of these massive spikes of healing of a Discipline Priest to the fucking up of a Druid clicking Rejuvenation, or a Holy Paladin misclicking Crusader Strike, Judgment, and Hammer of Wrath. How can you even misclick it? You literally cannot fail clicking those. So the fail window of a Discipline Priest is pretty tight, which is why it is not a very easy spec to get into at first. You have to learn the encounter, you have to learn the damage windows, you have to learn the mechanics, know when and how you should position to be able to have this preparation window unpreoccupied by whatever mechanic could come in and ruin your entire process, and then do the whole thing accordingly. As I mentioned, when it comes to Mythic Plus, the things are going to shrink down a little bit. When we look at the total overview of all the healers, it's going to look closer to this. There is no S tier, there is no D tier. Mythic Plus is more complicated. I don't feel like there are specs that are far above anyone else in difficulty, or specs that are far above anyone else in ease, because the skill floor of Mythic Plus is pretty high if you want to get good at the specs you're playing. So the only caveats I see here are that Holy Priest is a little bit easier, purely because of the least amount of utility it can use, and on top of that, the fact that it is very direct healing, very throughput healing based. It doesn't have many absorbs and heal preventions like a Discipline Priest, so a Discipline Priest also has to know better when the big damage is coming, because they have to use Rapture, because they have to use Absorb Shields, so they have to know beforehand when something bad is about to happen, which requires a little bit more knowledge. Not to mention they also do damage in their own kit, which requires a little bit more knowledge as well. The focus targeting of a Discipline Priest can also help the key progression in terms of damage, which is not something that a Holy Priest does often. Paladin gains a higher spot, even though I put it towards the bottom when it comes to raiding, because melee is already harder in raids. It becomes even harder in Mythic Plus. You start getting screwed by things like Spiteful, by things like Quaking and Sanguine. Plenty of mechanics you are supposed to be dodging, like the thrusts and the cone AoEs that you have to suffer if you are in melee and you're a healer, so it's pretty dangerous. As I mentioned, for Discipline, damage done is even more important in Mythic Plus, so it's even more important for you as a Paladin to do proper damage and focusing proper targets. So all of this requires more knowledge, more understanding of Mythic Plus, so it is harder to play. So this was the outlook of how healer specs are looking in terms of difficulty, in terms of complexity so far in this expansion. I have been waiting for a while, some more complexity, some more additions to Restoration Druid. I think Blizzard is kind of happy with the way it works. I think they like having, pretty different types of specs in how complex they are, so they don't see a reason to add anything else to Restoration Druid, but I would enjoy it. I would enjoy some more complexity to the spec, some more, maybe a couple more buttons that you could click to make the spec a little bit more entertaining, because I do think it is a little bit too boring, in my opinion, when it comes to raiding especially. None of the other specs in raiding are at that level. I think all of the specs are enjoyable enough in raiding, except for Restoration Druid. So that would be my main wish when it comes to healers. Let me guys know what you think about these ratings. I'm sure some of you will consider Restoration Druid super difficult to play in raid encounters somehow, some way, or someone will have found Discipline Priest to be very simple. Thank you for watching this video. If you have enjoyed this and if you have been a disciple of Jeanne d'Arc, you should subscribe to the channel. If you have not, you are probably an English traitor and your ancestors have helped burn at the stake an innocent 19-year-old girl, so you will still have this on your conscience. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, rest in peace, Jeanne d'Arc. I wished you had cooler video games and movies made about you.